I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from Russia when Ukrainian drones attack another oil depot. We analyse what we know about Ukraine's new ballistic missile, and we deep dive into the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 28th of August, 2 years and 191 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Director of Military Sciences at RUSI Matthew Saville, and Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David, hi team, welcome Matthew. Let's start in Russia. Somebody clearly a fan of De La Soul there, because 3 oil refineries have gone up overnight. Ukrainian drones have attacked another oil depot in Russia's Rostov region overnight, causing a huge blaze. Rostov is the region immediately to the east of Ukraine. Vasily Golubov, Rostov's governor, said 4 Ukrainian drones were destroyed over Russia's southern region last night, although he made no mention of the reported oil attack. The Baza Telegram channel, which is linked to Russia's security service, claims several tanks were on fire at the Kamensky district of Rostov. That's the district actually bordering Ukraine, about 20 kilometers east of Luhansk. And footage posted on social media showed at least 3 large tanks at the Atlas depot burning. Ukraine has not commented on the claims. They very rarely do. This comes, I should say, actually, as the fire at the oil depot in Prolatarsk, which is also in Rostov region, continues to burn into its 10th day. Secondly, then, reporting this morning says Ukrainian forces also hit a Russian oil depot in Kirov Oblast in Russia. That's over 1,100 kilometers from Ukraine. Local sources report that 4 Ukrainian drones hit the depot. If so, that would be one of the deepest drone attacks of the war so far. And then just in the last hour, explosions and a fire reported imagery on social media at the Ryazan power plant in Russia, about 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow. You'll find that footage. It's all over. It's breaking over social media at the moment. Now, these are all big strikes. I mean, the constant attack against Russian energy infrastructure, oil depot here, in many ways mirrors that Russia is attempting against Ukraine. You've got to wonder where the air defense is. I think it's probably prioritized around Moscow and in eastern Ukraine, but it does show that this stuff, like all the military equipment, is not in inexhaustible supply. Anyway, we'll keep an eye on those stories. Now, still in Russia and still with drone attacks, temporary restrictions were imposed at 2 Russian airports yesterday over fears of a drone strike. Firstly, Kazan Airport, that's 500 kilometers east of Moscow, has suspended operations. Planes heading there were instead diverted to an airfield in Samara. That's about 300 kilometers south. That's a bit dull, isn't it? Have to get on the bus from there, 300 kilometers back, pick your car up. And then a second airport in Nizhikhamsk, that's about 150 kilometers east of Ryazan, also suspended operations. And just, I've been looking for any updates on Ukraine's activity in the Kursk region. I've not found any there, but what I have found is Russia appears to have conducted an airstrike on an ice arena, a sort of ice rink on the northwest side of Sudzha in the Kursk region. So Russia's now continuing to bomb its own territory. There we go. Now into Ukraine, there are going to be blackouts in Kharkiv. We expect later on today. The whole region will suffer a power shutdown a little bit later, we are told, following the shelling of some energy facilities. This is from Kharkiv Energy on Telegram. Hourly and emergency shutdown schedules have been applied throughout Kharkiv Oblast that could lead to an increase in the duration of outages, the power company warned. And Russian bombardment in the eastern Ukraine region of Donetsk has killed 6 people this morning, according to Vadim Vilashkin, the governor of the region. In the village of Izmailivka, that's in Donetsk Oblast, about 20 k's west of Donetsk city itself, 30 k's south of Pokrovsk. A suspected guided bomb hit a house. The parents there, aged 45 and 53, their 24-year-old daughter and 17-year-old son were found dead under the rubble. I highlight that one just as a reminder that behind the, thankfully, low statistics in recent weeks of daily deaths and injuries, there are, of course, lives being ruined, or in this case, whole families being wiped out. Now, also today, a Russian missile has hit President Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih, as it was observing an official day of mourning for an attack the previous day, yesterday, that killed 4 civilians at a hotel that we reported on yesterday. The latest attack struck civilian infrastructure, wounded 4 people. I think that's been increased to 5, actually, just reports I've seen in the last few minutes. This comes from local administrative head Alexander Vilkul on social media. Then regional head Sergei Lysak said, when Kryvyi Rih is in mourning, the enemy attacks again, and it once again aims at civilians. Now, Tuesday's attack on Kryvyi Rih was part of that second day of intense bombardment across Ukraine that you may remember we were talking about yesterday. Excuse me. Elsewhere, geolocated footage published yesterday shows Russian forces have advanced over 2 kilometers from their last confirmed position into northwest Novorodivka. That's about 10k southeast of Pokrovsk. Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, say a Ukrainian soldier had reported in a now deleted Telegram post that Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from the town. That message was amplified by Russian state media and several Russian mill bloggers. ISW assessed that Russia's most capable combat-capable troops are leading the advance towards Pokrovsk, which, as I said yesterday, I think that there's no sign of Russia showing any intention of withdrawing forces from that region to bolster what's happening in Kursk. They have to take Pokrovsk to try and get some kind of victory. Seem to be taking forces from elsewhere, particularly down south. Now, the next one, Russia wants the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency to take a, quote, more objective and clearer stance on nuclear safety, it is Moscow said today. Now, this comes a day after Rafael Grossi, who's the head of the IAEA, visited Russia's Kursk nuclear plant, close to where Ukrainian troops are in their sort of lodgement in the country. Now, Mr. Grossi visited the plant yesterday. He warned of the risks of a perilous nuclear accident happening there. He said he had inspected damage from a suspected drone strike, which Russia had blamed on Ukraine, although Mr. Grossi didn't apportion any responsibility. He did, though, say the danger or possibility of a nuclear accident has emerged near here. Then Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that Moscow wanted the IAEA to have a more objective and clearer position on nuclear security, although she denied it was demanding that the energy should take a pro-Russian stance. Yes. She said Moscow is not in favour of confirming Moscow's position, but in favour of facts with one specific goal: ensuring safety and preventing the development of a scenario along a catastrophic path to which the Kyiv regime is pushing everyone. Yeah, so she's absolutely not asking the IAEA to take Moscow's stance. That's very clear. Now, Rafael Grossi told a news conference that the plant was extremely fragile because it had no protective dome. He said the site was currently still operational and very close to normal conditions, but that meant the situation regarding its security was even more serious. Russia has claimed the plant has been repeatedly attacked by Ukrainian forces since their push into the country about 3 weeks ago. And then amazingly, and in absolutely no way at all related to Rafael Grossi's visit, Moscow said this morning that Russian troops had found and defused a US-made HIMARS just a couple of kilometers away from the nuclear power plant. The Russian National Guard's press service said the rocket launcher was found about 5 k's away from the nuclear facility. Yeah, completely by coincidence. That's good enough for me. Now then, yesterday we talked about President Zelensky at the forum in Kyiv yesterday, and he gave a press conference afterwards, which was occurring whilst we were on air, so we couldn't bring it all to you. But a bit more from his press conference at the 2024 Independence Forum in Kyiv yesterday. He said Ukraine's invasion of Kursk is part of a wider plan to force Russia into peace. He said other stages of the plan included Kyiv having greater involvement in global security infrastructure, forcing Moscow into peace via diplomacy, as well as putting economic pressure on Russia. He said Ukraine had the industrial capacity to produce between 1.5 and 2 million drones a year, but he said they lacked the funding to do so. And he offered the opinion that the war would eventually end through dialogue, and said that he's going to be presenting a new peace plan to the US presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, as well as President Joe Biden. He confirmed, actually, there were rumours, but then he confirmed Western-supplied F-16 fighter jets had been used to counter Russia's recent missile and drone attacks on Sunday and Monday nights. He said, "We destroyed already some missiles and drones using the F-16. He also, and we'll pick this up a little bit later with Matthew, he revealed Ukraine has successfully its first domestically produced ballistic missile. His comments come a day after Rustem Umerov, who's Ukraine's defense minister, said Kyiv had plans to produce its own weapons to respond to Russian drone and missile attacks. Now then, a couple more for me. On the sort of international front, the Kremlin says, words to make you pay attention always, I'm sure. The Kremlin says European consumers will face higher prices unless Kyiv agrees to extend a deal on Russian gas transit via Ukraine once the deal expires at the end of the year. Ukraine has repeatedly said it has no plans to strike a new gas transit deal with Russia when the current one ends on 31st of December. This hasn't gone down well in Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that if Kyiv did not extend the deal, Russia could find alternative routes, such as the planned Turkish gas hub. He said there are other routes, but of course such decisions by the Ukrainian side will cause serious damage to the interests of European consumers, those who still want to buy more guaranteed, more affordable. He added that Europe will have to pay more for gas from other sellers, including LNG, the liquefied natural gas from the US. I think he doth protest too much. I've got a sneaking suspicion, given how much he's denying how much they care about it, that Russia is quite peeved by the whole thing. And then finally for me, David, the UK and Germany have pledged unyielding support for Ukraine. Britain's new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is in Germany today. He's just given a press conference with Olaf Scholz, where they said UK and German support for Ukraine remained unyielding. I said that already. Sorry about that. The PM was speaking at a press conference in Berlin with Herr Scholz, and he said he set out his talk, said his ambition was to turn a corner on Brexit. Okay, let's see. He said Ukraine people were not just fighting to defend themselves from Russian aggression, but also for all the people across Europe. And he then promised, here we go, right, get your bingo cards ready. He promised support for Kyiv for as long as it takes. Well done. You can tick that one off. And that's us up to date, David.
Well, thank you so much, Dom, for all of that. Let's go to our guest then, Matthew Saville, Director of Military Sciences at RUSI. Matthew, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your job. What do you look at when it comes to military science in terms of the Russo-Ukrainian war?
Yeah, Director of Military Science is somewhat a grand title. I mean, military sciences is really, it's quite an old term. What we effectively do is we study modern warfare. So we look at people, equipment, technology, tactics, concepts and doctrine. We look across the totality of what makes up military power, basically. And RUSI as an institute is defense and security. So then there are a number of other teams here who look at things like cyber capabilities, international security, which is like the drivers of conflict, big power politics, as people look at terrorism, financial crime, and we weave in and out of all of that. And at RUSI, in the military sciences team, Ukraine has actually been a huge driver of our research over the past couple of years. And that is because it is providing examples of old concepts coming back into vogue. It's a huge battleground for both, land, sea and air warfare. We've seen the use of some cyber capabilities. Electronic warfare has been a huge factor in there. And then there's the real, if you like, big experiment on the use of uncrewed systems, be they essentially explosive boats, surveillance drones, and things that under normal circumstances you might call a cruise missile, which are turning up as, in essence, loitering munitions or first-person view drones. So we are pulling lots of lessons about modern warfare from Ukraine, and we compare this to what we understand from the rest of the world. So we're not Ukraine obsessed, but it is the current if you like, test bed for so much in the way of how a combination of modern technology and old tactics or novel tactics, particularly on the Ukrainian side, are being used in the largest kind of industrial scale war in Europe for 60, 70 years.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. Let's dive right in then. President Zelensky, as Dom said that Ukraine has developed a new ballistic missile. What do we know about this missile and how do we think it was developed?
In truth, not a huge amount. Ukraine's had a number of programs over the years and things that were left over from, like, the Soviet era. And actually, in where the focus has been on the development of Ukrainian weapons throughout this war, ballistic missiles have sort of crept in, pun not intended, like under the radar, in that the main focus has been on integrating Western equipment, be that sophisticated cruise missiles or things like that, into their arsenal, alongside lots of heavy armor. And then the important bit, the development of Ukrainian defense industry based a lot on their commercial sector, so drones and other equipment. And ballistic missiles haven't really featured. From what we can tell, this is probably either an upgrade or development of a previous system like the Toshka, which is basically an old Soviet ballistic missile. And you're looking at something which potentially has a range of a few hundred kilometers, maybe 300 or so. It's not that dissimilar from the sort of category of weapon that the Ukrainians have recently received from the US in the form of the ATACMS, which is a ballistic missile that can be fitted into what is normally a guided multiple launch rocket system. In this case, the thing that's called HIMARS, which fires lots and lots of rockets, but you can essentially swap out the launcher and put in something that fires a small ballistic missile.
Matthew, before we hand over to Dom and Roland, I'm sure we'll have questions as well. Obviously, over the past few weeks, we've heard a lot about this question of whether the Ukrainians will be allowed by the West to fire Western-donated weapons. And the fear there from, we think, the Germans and some others is that this would be counted as an escalation. Is this an escalation? Do you think the Ukrainian development of a new ballistic missile will upset Washington in any way or not?
It's difficult to really know because, I used to be in government and work in the MOD and do a lot of Russia and Ukraine work. It's not easy now to know exactly what does or doesn't trigger concern in Washington in terms of specific developments. The big picture is that not unreasonably, the US points to a lot of what's going on inside and around Ukraine as a European security problem and say, hey, Europe, are you going to step up to the plate and deal with this problem? And at the moment, what they would argue is if this all goes wrong and we somehow end up with some kind of conflict between NATO member states and Russia, in truth, it's the US that essentially buys out the risk. It's US capabilities and overall it's US nuclear deterrence that is effectively matched up against the Russians. So, dear Europeans, particularly you more aggressive ones, could you be careful about dragging us in? In terms of this, the truth is the Russians are launching long-range cruise missiles against Ukrainian civilians, and they are using ballistic missiles like the Iskander against Ukrainian targets. And I think that the Ukrainians developing their own ballistic missile is in many respects just essentially that's priced into where we are in the war at the moment. And it would be difficult for, I would suggest, the Russians to, if you like, be much aggrieved if Ukrainian ballistic missiles started hitting targets in Russia, provided they were military targets. I think some of that is what lies behind the current Kursk incursion, which is that I think we need to wait some time to actually see how successful that is because we don't know the cost that the Ukrainians will pay as part of that incursion. But what they are doing is showing up some of the Russian rhetoric about, if you like, the inviolability of Russian territory, and they are pressing on those vulnerabilities to make a case we need to be able to fight this war to win. And the fact that the front line, which has moved backwards and forwards inside Ukraine, now straddles or has crossed the border, should be neither here nor there.
Matthew, hi, it's Dom. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really interested in your thoughts here from the sort of battlefield perspective. You're talking there about the risk being priced in from Russia's perspective, But up to now, policy shifts have largely gone hand in hand from the West with the nature of the equipment gifted. Tanks, what does that mean? Are we prepared to allow that to happen at the same time as the tank itself moves in, artillery, etc., etc.? But now Ukraine's developed its own technology out of kilter with the West timeframe management, if you like. It could mean that those two things, the conversation around the policy and the gifting of the equipment, get out of kilter. The Brits, for example, we could push the policy envelope to test the lines on long-range strikes. So how big a risk do you think it is now if one NATO or Western partner shifts a policy position, and there's an obvious gap with allies?
So one of the things is, of course, we don't know how close this ballistic missile is to actual deployment. So a successful test might mean it could turn up in the next couple of months. It could be another year away. So that's always something to bear in mind. The second thing is that it's not 100% clear how it would play into the long-range weapon debate. You might find that those who are more cautious say it's better to let the Ukrainians develop their own weapon, and therefore there isn't an imperative to free up permissions on Western weapons like ATACMS and Storm Shadow, although we can come back to what they can and can't do. I think the point that you raised, though, about a public split, that is a real danger. There has been a degree of, if you like, cajoling from the UK as one of the kind of people at the leading edge of the pack thus far in terms of trying to move the debate along by the scope and volume of what it donates to Ukraine. So going hard early on after the February expansion of the Russian invasion with weapons and armored vehicles and other equipment to sort of say, like, this is an investment worth making. Then going in with our own M270, which is a guided multiple launch rocket system, and that being followed by US HIMARS, and then Challenger 2 tanks, AS-90 self-propelled guns, armor, unlocking other armor, and then Storm Shadow going hand in hand with the French providing Scalp, and then ideally being followed by ATACMS as it was. But there's a degree of, if you like, forcing there, has slightly pushed the pace and might have created friction, although I think it's been successful. If right now you had a public split and disagreement over those escalation dynamics, the risk is that what you would do is you would expose the partners who are the most forward-leaning to, if you like, being singled out for pressure by Russia. Russia would try and think about, okay, does that tell us that the Brits or the French or others are on their own? And to that extent, I think that's why some of the public debate that's been taking place over Storm Shadow has probably not been helpful, because what everybody involved would want to do was effectively come to agreement in private. You probably don't want to announce it. You want the Russians, the first they know of any change in position is when something large and expensive explodes.
Absolutely. Now, but you can look at these weapons in many, many different ways, just battlefield utility or wider political effect. Could you just sort of branch this out a little bit? We hear a lot of discussion around terms such as horizontal and vertical escalation. Can you point us out what is the difference between horizontal and vertical, and where you put this debate about policy permissions and specifically this new ballistic missile whenever it's going to arrive from Ukraine?
Got it. So you're now touching on something that I love, which is sort of concepts and doctrine, although everyone disagrees over these. But broadly speaking, vertical escalation is where you essentially have a direct and, if you like, upwards raising of the temperature in a very in a kind of clear cause and effect in terms of often conventional weapons. So you would start by attacking a certain set of targets. Your adversary would up the ante by going more violently or more forcefully at other targets. They would attack in greater volume. In essence, vertical escalation has been the Russians upping the ante against civilian targets and basically attacking more violently inside Ukraine. Horizontal escalation is normally, essentially, as it sounds like, it's sort of going sideways. So you don't respond directly and obviously, but what you do is you put pressure somewhere else, often through using completely different means. So you might pressure someone's economy by suddenly introducing sanctions, or you might flood a particular market full of certain raw materials to depress the value of something and basically try and attack someone's, like steel sector or industrial production sector, or you conduct subversive operations and sabotage and covert activity. And this last area is the one that, whilst the Russians have been escalating vertically inside Ukraine, there is some evidence based on what governments are telling us and what's being picked up by journalists that the Russians are trying to sabotage and interfere with Western support in other areas, sort of, mysterious files at warehouses, that kind of thing. And that becomes, in many respects, less of a military problem as so much as like almost a covert warfare problem or an intelligence problem. Can you catch the people who are doing this? Can you identify their links with Russian intelligence? Can you arrest people? Essentially, how do you deal with that in a way that doesn't involve you bombing each other? And so that, if that makes sense, that's broadly how those escalation dynamics play out.
Thank you. It's fascinating you raise the issue there of these alleged subversive operations throughout Europe, because I was going to ask you a question on it. But also, I mean, that really does, in terms of the escalation dynamic and the US and others rightly being nervous of nuclear escalation. I mean, you could argue, well, if this is an attack on European soil, then where's Article 5? So, I mean, it is an interesting dynamic. And I just wonder how do you rate the response by Europe and the US to these alleged what's called grey zone attacks on commercial defence industrial facilities and other things throughout Europe?
Yeah, so I think we're beginning to, I mean, this is a classic of one of the challenges that's always sat at the heart of Article 5 is that it has a degree of built-in ambiguity, and that's to give you a little bit of wriggle room. And of course, classically in the Cold War, we had all of this kind of secret war going on in the background. And in many respects, we slightly forgot about that. But the recent examples of, say, the attack on the Skripals, a lot of people are talking about those like, well, it's a chemical weapons attack in Europe. This is Article 5. But you can go back. Obviously, it's slightly less risk of more innocent people being pulled in. But of course, the Russians used poison to kill Yevgeny Markov in London something years ago. So in some respects, the way that battle is fought is behind the scenes and in the shadows through law enforcement and intelligence and disruption. And that is built in to try and mean that it doesn't become huge and escalatory, that you don't then have a large sabotage effect, for example, that causes a clamour for some kind of military response. That you in essence, one of the theories behind why people often indulge in horizontal escalation is that it's a means of putting pressure on without risking that open conflict, but it means that the respondent or the defender also has the ability to effectively use horizontal means of response to try and keep it out of the public eye, to keep the heat out of it. And so it's difficult to grade the response because, of course, it is entirely plausible that response activity is going on and that we won't know about it until months hence, when we'd suddenly discover a load of Russian diplomats, in inverted commas, are expelled, and then a bunch of apparently unconnected people are in court on arson charges, and it turns out that is actually the Russian proxy network basically being sent to prison.
Yes, I mean, I've got a couple more. Just on that last point there, I'd love to ask you today about some new commentary on RUSI that's saying that Russian bot activity is going away from attacking Britain's support for Ukraine directly onto trying to big up or amplify the far right here. And we have seen instances of British nationals very recently be charged with setting fire to, there was a warehouse of direct relevance to Ukrainian supply in, I think, East London that went up just a couple of months ago. But anyway, that I don't think we've got time to dig into that, but I recommend people go and read the article on RUSI's website. But just on your point there about war being broader, where are the edges into law enforcement and intelligence and so on? War is obviously much broader. The war in Ukraine is much broader than just the Prokrovsk front. You got the Black Sea, the attacks on the energy infrastructure, denial of the air, the whole lot. Now, President Zelensky was speaking yesterday about this war ending through dialogue. Do you see any battlefield victory? And if it has to end through dialogue, where do you think each side currently stand?
It's almost inevitable that in the absence of, if you like, a essentially a total victory on the battlefield, which I don't think is hugely likely at the moment, in terms of like either the total ejection of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, and I'd include Donbass and Crimea in that, or something that looks like the original plan for the Russian invasion, which is essentially getting all the way to Kyiv and toppling the government, that essentially some kind of negotiation is inevitable. The question is the terms of those negotiations. And on that score, at the moment, you would say that the Russians have got a lot of advantages insofar as they hold a large swathe of Ukrainian territory. And if you were to ask the Ukrainians what their success criteria are, it's the Russians holding a lot less than they currently hold. And so it feels like they've got further to go. Because, of course, what the second thing that the Russians are trying to do is fundamentally undermine the effective working of Ukraine as a functioning state and to keep it weak. Which means keeping it out of the EU, potentially, definitely keeping it out of NATO, undermining its ability to make money and to have a functioning economy. It's essentially a destructive approach. And they've got the numbers. Now, in the medium term, there is no reason why effective, particularly European military support, which means a combination of training, but overwhelmingly material and equipment, if Europe ramped up its industrial capacity, couldn't effectively compete with Russian capacity. We already think there's a bit of a challenge and a bottleneck for Russia later in 2025 on the basis that so much of what it's done recently has been to refurbish equipment rather than build completely new equipment. They're building a lot of new cruise missiles, but on the ground, a lot of what they've done is refurbish old stuff. And at a certain point, they'll run out of old things to refurbish and they will need to start producing new things. And there is more that the international community can do to squeeze its components that come in, that go into a variety of weapon systems. Not necessarily cut it off, like Russia can take a lot of pain, and it's still got an enormous pool of people to throw into the fight. But there is cause for, if the Ukrainians can stabilize and keep going, Europe should be able to, and the West, should be able to support it. I think the problem is that right now, it's looking quite difficult in terms of Ukraine being in a strong position on the ground going into 2025. And I say that in spite of the success of the Kursk incursion, because that could provide some fairly significant leverage at some point. But right now, it's not, if you like, reduce the pressure in the East. And at some point, it will have to consider how much it wants to invest in holding that chunk of Russia in the face of what, rather than an overwhelming counterattack, might be something that is more attritional and just chips away at Ukrainian forces over the other side of the border.
Thank you so much for your time. We'll come back to you at the end for your final thoughts. You alluded there to the operation in Kursk. Let's go to our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant. Roland, the mastermind of the Kursk operation is the current Ukrainian commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky. What was the thinking of the general before the operation? What was his track record?
The way people looked at him. I mean, look, Alexander Syrsky is a fairly controversial figure, to be absolutely honest. And there are strong feelings about him, both for and against. I spent several days on the phone to many sources. No one wants to speak on the record about this because it's a sensitive topic. But here's the basic background, and this will give you an idea of why we decided to profile him now. So let me just give you the basics. Alexander Syrsky, he's 59. He was born in the Vladimir region of Russia, east of Moscow. He moved to Kharkiv as a teenager, joined the army, went to the Moscow Higher Military Command School, which was like Soviet Sandhurst, basically. Served in Afghanistan in the 1980s. When the Soviet Union broke up, his unit was absorbed into the Ukrainian military. He remained there. He was one of the generals who commanded Ukrainian forces during the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014-2015. By 2019, he was commander of the ground forces. So if you imagine Zaluzhny, his predecessor as supreme commander, was running everything, army, navy, air force, the whole ground forces. Syrski at that point was in charge of the ground forces, and since the war began, he was associated with several major successes. I mean, the big ones are early in the war. He was credited with overseeing the successful defense of Kiev in the first month of the war, where the Russians finally had to retreat, and also that massive, very striking, stunning blitzkrieg into Kharkiv region that liberated a very large chunk of Kharkiv region in September that year. So he's experienced, he's well trained, he is a general's general, very by the book. His reputation is also marred by this reputation for, I can put it this way, if you speak to Ukrainian infantrymen or squaddies, the most polite thing they will say is he is a conservative tactics guy. And when you ask people what that means in less polite terms, it means he's an old-fashioned Soviet kind of general, and he's prepared to waste guys' lives. And the most notorious example of that is the Battle of Bakhmut. It lasted 10 months. Syrski was basically running that, or he's considered to have run it. And the view, not just of a lot of soldiers who fought there, but also Ukrainian and foreign kind of military observers, was the Ukrainians tried to hold on to Bakhmut for far too long, even when it became clear that the balance of attrition wasn't really favoring them. Yes, the Russians were taking high casualties, but the Ukrainians could afford those casualties much less than the Russians could, and they held on even when it's clear the city was going to be lost. They could have pulled back. Syrski insisted on trying to hold that city. There are all kinds of anecdotes about him kind of refusing permission for small units to, say, pull out of a building that was surrounded or compromised, because it didn't want to give up space, and as a result, losses were taken. So that is where this reputation comes from. And some people have been quite cruel about that. I've been calling him like the butcher of Bakhmut, and some people have, frankly accused him of being very, very callous with his men's lives, and basically being unimaginative on the battlefield. I mean, since he took over from Valery Zaluzhny, I think everybody agrees that he has had a very difficult time. I mean, when he took over in February, the Ukrainian army is in a bad place, outnumbered, outgunned. American military aid was frozen, so the Russians had more men, more shells. His first big decision was the retreat from Avdiivka, which probably was inevitable. And he's presided over, until this Kursk operation, he's basically presided over a quite depressing, grinding, demoralizing retreat across the Donbass. And the nearest thing he had to any success or a victory was containing, I think is the word, the Russian offensive into Kharkiv in May, but that wasn't exactly a victory. So the Kursk offensive has begun to change views of him, as well as the narrative around the war itself.
Well, that leads us right to the next question then. How much do we need to reappraise our thinking of him? How much have your contacts changed their views? I mean, there's been some talk of him, I think was a politician in the Rada called him the Ukrainian Zhukov. Could you talk us through that? Yeah, I mean, look, the Zhukov thing comes from a Ukrainian MP called Mariana Berzhula. She sits on the Rada Security and Defense Committee. Now, she's quite a controversial figure. Not everybody likes her. And she was bitterly critical of Valery Zaluzhny as well. And the Zhukov thing, it's deliberately backhanded, right? It's something of a compliment. Zhukov, won the Second World War for the Red Army. He's known as a master of maneuver, but he's also the quintessential Soviet general, right? Stalin's marshal, a man he told General Eisenhower, actually, this is how we clear minefields. Like, if I encounter a minefield, I send my infantry to attack as if the minefield isn't there, because if you think about it, we only take as many casualties doing that as we would if we were attacking an area defended by a lot of German troops anyway. So either way, I'm going to lose men. What the hell? Send them in. Once the infantry have detonated all of the anti-personnel mines, then the sappers get to work on the anti-tank stuff. And Eisenhower put that in his diaries, and it's a mixture of fascinated and appalled. But so when you talk about Zhukov, yes, he's the marshal who won the war, but also his victories were costly, and he is the very, what's the song?
the very model
of a modern major general.
He was the very model of a Soviet marshal of the Red Army, and that is, the classic insult that people will level at Syrskyi. They'll say he's a Sovok. That's an insulting term for a kind of old-fashioned Soviet-minded person. And I think, if you think about Zhukov's reputation, he's a legend, but he's a legend because he won. And I think for that reason, it's too early to really make the judgment about Syrskyi. And I think a lot is going to depend on this Kursk operation. I think the sense is certainly that he's taking a very, very big risk. He's bet a lot of cards on that operation, and we're not quite sure how it's going to work out.
Roland, you mentioned there the kind of backhanded compliment he got from an MP, the Ukrainian Zhukov. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the political machinations behind the scenes that we should be aware of? As a foreign audience, often I think we're not so clued up on who's rising in the radar, who's not, and what all this means. What's your reading there?
I mean, full disclosure, I find it difficult to keep the pulse of backdoor Ukrainian politics right up to speed and checking that, but. Look, there's a number of layers to this. I mean, one aspect is there have been rumours around, the kind of word on the well-informed street. I had it from multiple sources, actually, while reporting this story, okay, is that, look, Syrskyi he's also fighting a rearguard action because there's people back in Kyiv who want to get rid of him. Now, it's been reported elsewhere. This is what people I spoke to said. The belief is that Andrei Yermak, the chief of staff, Zelensky's chief of staff, is behind that and has been orchestrating a campaign. That kind of peaked in June, and it was connected to the Kharkiv offensive. So when the Russians came crashing across the border, yes, it was contained eventually, but at the beginning they made quite rapid progress, and the Ukrainian forces were basically failed to hold them up. And there were a lot of questions asked because everyone knew that offensive was going to happen, right? So we were even writing an article about what will Russia's anticipated Kharkiv offensive look like when it happened. So it wasn't a secret. Why did that happen? He took a lot of flack for that, and there are attempts to get rid of him. And several people said to me, look, there is a feeling, a suspicion, I can't say it's true or not. There's definitely a lot of people in Kyiv and outside Kyiv who feel that part of this Kursk operation may be it's Syrskyi trying to redeem himself in a way, deciding, look, I need a win. There's another layer to that political question, which is about the kind of the political calculations that go into this offensive, right? Everyone I've spoken to says Syrskyi, like he's a tactics guy. He's a soldier. He's, he thinks about fighting wars and defeating the Russians and what happens on the battlefield. He just doesn't think about political big picture stuff. That's Zelensky's kind of, I'm losing my words. That's Zelensky's job, basically. And we know President Zelensky has already made quite clear that part of the objective here was to put, as we were talking about, put Ukraine in a better position, more coercive position at peace talks if it comes. We can make an educated guess about why it came now. I mean, the offensive started when in August. Give it a month of planning, and you get back to that disastrous debate that Joe Biden had with Donald Trump. You can make the educated guess that a lot of this is about the anticipation that you might have a Donald Trump in the White House and Ukraine might be forced to the negotiating table sooner or later. And of course, look, there are always political kind of considerations in running a war, right? And those kinds of considerations have to override certain things at certain moments. And it's not just about who wins at the tactical level here and there. But that said, look, political interference has been an issue throughout this war, I think, for both sides, right? And there are people will make the case that, look, Syrskyi not retreating from Bakhmut, and then Syrskyi insisting on deploying very good troops that could otherwise have been used in the Zaporizhia counteroffensive to try and retake Bakhmut for no discernible gain. I mean, he acts on the instructions of his boss, who is Zelensky. So if Kursk doesn't work out, then that's going to be on Zelensky as well as on Syrskyi. But also, I mean, the other thing to note there, David, is that another thing about Syrskyi is his reputation for he's got a thing about hierarchy, right? This goes back to the kind of, he's an old Soviet thinking man kind of allegation, right? He's reputed to have, he doesn't really have friends. He has subordinates, and he expects you to do what he says. And the flip side of that is that he will obey the orders that he's given as well. And one thing that both his defenders and his critics seem to agree on is that one reason he was chosen to replace Valery Zaluzhny was because he was less likely to answer back to Zelensky. He was more likely to, basically, that he's thought of as more pliable.
Well, thank you so much, Roland, for taking us into your thinking there. Just finally, would you sketch out how your personal thinking about Syrskyi and his operation has changed over the past few months? I mean, I think you've sketched out for us the different positions on him by different schools of thought, different people you speak to. What do you personally think?
I don't know. I mean, I've never met the guy. I mean, I think I've got a better idea, having done this reporting, about the kind of character he is. I mean, by all accounts, he's not especially charismatic. I think his defenders would definitely say he suffers from a perception problem, just because his predecessor, Valery Zaluzhny, is just a charismatic guy. Like, people just like him. And he made an effort actually to get people to like him. One person said to me, look, that Syrskyi, like, people don't really like him, and he's not really that keen on being liked. He's keen on winning a war. And that kind of, so no wonder people complain about him. I've definitely heard enough anecdotes to believe that the complaints about him being a micromanager are true. So there've been multiple kind of stories about him micromanaging. I mean, down to the company level, which is pretty shocking for a general to be showing up at brigade headquarters and telling, like, particular company commanders that, oh, right, you can't pull out of that tree line 100 meters or something like that. And there's definitely a lot of ill will about that kind of thing. I think the flip side of that is that his personal bravery isn't in doubt. He likes to be down the front. He likes to be out in the field, which is how he ends up in these situations where he's micromanaging brigades and battalions, to the irritation of his brigade and battalion commanders. And he's got a mastery of the detail. You can see he's got a mastery of the detail, and you can see that boldness. I mean, maybe we will. The Zhukov comparison is a little bit, well, is it overblown? I don't know. But I mean, in terms of kind of tactical execution, the Kharkiv operation is really, really successful. I mean, it was textbook. He took his best units. He employed those American Stryker vehicles exactly how they were meant to be employed. He selected a weak part of the line. He achieved complete surprise. All brilliantly done. And I think he has to be given credit for that. I think the big question is Istanbul, right? Because if you look down the way at not Donetsk and Pokrovsk, I think it's clear that he admitted it himself, right? The Russians know that what we want is for them to take troops away from Pokrovsk, and they're reluctant to do that, and so their advance is accelerating. I mean, at the moment they're so close to Pokrovsk, you could see them on the outskirts of Pokrovsk. I reckon possibly within a week or two. I saw an assessment from the Center for Defense Strategies, the Ukrainian military think tank, saying that by mid-September the Russians will be near to Pokrovsk. Now, one narrative that's being put out there, I've heard it from some Ukrainian military sources. I've heard it from the CDS, put it in their analysis as well, is that that's where the Russians are going to be held, right? That the Russians will culminate in the Battle of Pokrovsk, and that the idea there's going to be a great big Ukrainian collapse is untrue. But nonetheless, Kursk has taken a lot of resources. It's not free. Really good units have been attrited in achieving that success. If they want to hold the ground now, and it becomes just another section of line where the Ukrainians have to commit troops to sit in trenches to hold the line, is that really a win? So there's an awful lot riding on it, and I don't think, I mean, we don't even know if there's going to be of that offensive operation. I think it is too early, to be quite honest, to make a judgment about the outcome of that operation, and thus the assessment of Alexander Syrskyi's historic legacy.
Roland Oliphant, thank you so much for your reporting. Coming up, we hear Dom, Matthew and Roland's final thoughts. Let's go then to our final thoughts. Dom Nichols, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, David. I have been looking at some stuff as we had Matthew on today. I've been looking at Russi, and I see that he did a piece recently with our friends and colleagues at Times Radio. I believe that's some other audio product, but never mind. Anyway, he was speaking about, and Matthew, you were speaking with Times Radio about, well, the headline ended up, Putin in danger of palace coup after Moscow drone attack rocks oligarchs. And I've just been thinking about that in the context of these recent strikes, the Ukrainian strikes on dual-purpose commercial facilities, manufacturers of military equipment, oil depots, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking, the longer these go on, these types of strikes, the greater chance there is of the oligarchs and the wider Siloviki coming to the decision Putin is no longer good for business, which is obviously what they care about. And I'd point you to today's comments from Dmitry Peskov about the gas transit deal. So I just think we should think about these, or look at these attacks on oil and other sort of commercial facilities. And I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, Matthew, if you had time, and see it as well as damaging the economy and the war effort. But they will. There's a potential to have an effect directly against Putin himself if the people around him, the clique around him, think that this bloke is no longer good for business. They can't service their yacht in the south of France. They can't go and see their mistress in southern Italy, and they can't send their kids to Oxford. This is going to have an effect on these people. So we shouldn't just see it as, oh, well, I'm sure Russia's got lots more oil somewhere else. There is much more to play for here.
Yes. So, I mean, the first thing I should say is that I think that might have been one of the ones where I was on with another guest, and it was them who was, I think they were being slightly more expensive. And then I'm always surprised at the headlines that people are able to draw from things that I might not have actually said.
You're surprised. You just think we feel actually right.
Indeed. I know you've always got to cut journalists some slack when you claim about this headline is wildly inaccurate, like the journalist doesn't write it. This is where you get into sort of Kremlinology, and I should say I am not like a deep expert in this, and I think it's interesting listening to people like Mark Galeotti or the UK's former DA in Moscow, John Foreman, who I think they are a little bit sceptical about the extent to which that genuinely imperils the government in Russia and Putin in particular. So as much as, but there's clearly some pressure there. Like the fact that a chunk of Russian territory, even though in total landmass, I think it's like 0.02% or something, that has a cost on the government and, if you like, the regime and people associated with it, because they either have to counter it or they have to suppress it. And I think we've seen a little bit of both recently. But at the same time, the Russian system is pretty resilient, and that is part the kind of the stranglehold of the security system at the moment. It is part, and I'm aware there's a degree of kind of wild generalization and cliche here, the kind of the Russian psyche in terms of a combination of machismo and sort of stoicism. This is the country that took tens of millions of casualties in the Second World War, that has been invaded multiple times, but prides itself on always repelling those invaders at greater cost to them. That if you're being honest, throughout the course of this conflict has suffered mishap after mishap, but has just keeps on rolling. This invasion was supposed to take days or a couple of weeks. It wasn't supposed to be the case that the Black Sea Fleet was forced out of its own headquarters and sent, if you like, scurrying back to the eastern Black Sea in Novorossiysk. It wasn't supposed to be the case that the Ukrainians could cross the border and invade. And it wasn't supposed to be the case that Russian air bases and Russian petroleum facilities that are supporting the war machine are targets for Ukrainian drone strikes. Like, these guys don't have much of an air force. They don't have a navy much anymore. How are they? They're not supposed to be able to do this. But the Russian system is fairly resilient, and that is a fundamental part of the narrative that is sold. And indeed, if you like, the sunk cost. They are in this to achieve something out of it. And so, given that those oligarchs were already under a degree of financial pressure from sanctions, I'm not sure if that is a viable route to victory. But who knows? It's a bit like the adage about, I think it's going bankrupt, isn't it? How did you go bankrupt? Well, slowly at first, then quickly. It's difficult to know what bits of the regime are in fact brittle rather than resilient. And I'm always a bit skeptical about jumping to large-scale conclusions on the basis of trying to read the tea leaves of what's going on. And how does Putin look today in this video? And where's he sitting at the table with his whichever lackey he is berating today on public television? Like, it's genuinely difficult to know. I mean, as I said, to return to, there are definitely more, and some of the researchers here on the financial side and on looking at industry have identified areas where more pain could be inflicted on the Russian military-industrial complex and in the form of better targeted sanctions and components that are going in. I think there isn't a substitute, though, for what ends up as combat power around the front line and what the industrial strength that sits behind that is. And that is where the international supporters of Ukraine have got to look at themselves and say, if they're prepared to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, what does that really mean? And what does that look like over several years? And the Ukrainians have got to look at themselves and say, how are we going to assemble a campaign, largely on the ground, but supported by effects on the air and at sea, to turn the tide and materially affect how the Russians are operating? I think they have successfully challenged the narrative with this Kursk operation, but I'm glad that I'm not the only one who is saying it might be weeks or months before we really know if it was worth it, because we don't know the cost yet. And I think that's the kind of the message that we end up with at the moment, is really understanding what is the cost and what is the gain here, beyond an undoubted temporary boost to morale and potentially international profile.
Well, thank you, Matthew, so much for your time. It's been really excellent hearing your thoughts and also those of Dom and Roland. Roland, let's come to you last then for your very final thought. Don't worry, it can be brief. I know you've been speaking quite a lot today.
I'm sorry, do you not like the sound of my voice?
I love it, Roland. You know I like it, but I'm aware we push you all very hard on this podcast.
Be like that. So listen, I guess first of all, finishing up on General Syrskyi. So Mariana Bezhula, the MP I was talking about there, she left a comment on our story on Twitter, and our headlines, as we were talking about headlines that you don't write, the one on that is he a genius general or a butcher? And she says she doesn't think he's either the first or the second. It's all mixed up. He's a historical figure, strong-willed, intellectual, self-confident. He can advance compared to the others, has no boundaries of traditional ethics and morality. Overall, I think Syrskyi, with such power, is a problem for the Ukrainian army. He will wipe her down, and he won't build anything in return. It's already clear. He was a commander of the ground forces for 5 years. He's crazy enough to bet on everything. So that's her assessment. I think I've laid out that I feel that a lot rides, I think, on this operation and what's happening right now. There is this sense that where the parameters of this war have shifted. Even Zelensky has moved from talking about victory to talking about forcing Russia to peace on favorable terms. It's clear that this operation is partly directed at coercing Russia to the negotiating table on those terms, and the nature of what's going on, the nature of the gamble in Kursk, putting those forces in, crossing the border, and apparently at the expense of risking a major Russian advance in Donbass, it's the kind of gamble that makes you think, are we in the end game? I don't know. But as I said, look, the Russians are likely to be fighting on the outskirts of Pokrovsk within a few weeks, probably in less than a few weeks at the current rate of advance. The question is whether they will culminate there or whether or not they're going to go much, much further. So keep your eyes on it. It's a remarkably, what's the word? It's a very tense time. I think there's a lot of stuff in play right now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.